I'm Del Elliott, the founding director of the Blueprints Initiative, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here into colorful Colorado and Denver. I'm delighted that you made it. Those of you who came in on Sunday night, it was, I'm sure, a very difficult ride from DIA into the hotel, but we're glad you all made it. Our hope for all of you is that these next 2 days, and if you've been here for the pre-conference, including that time, will be a special time of learning for you. It is our hope that while you're here, you will be exposed to a lot of good information about how programs come to be identified as blueprint programs or evidence-based programs. Excuse me. Learning about how programs are implemented with fidelity. There are lots of lessons to be learned from what you're going to hear while you're here about successful implementation of these programs with fidelity around the country. So it's our hope that you will have a time of learning and that when you leave, that you'll all be ambassadors for the Blueprints Initiative. It's my privilege this morning to introduce to you Clay Yeager. Clay is a longtime acquaintance with the Blueprints Initiative. Clay was actually was working with Governor Ridge in Pennsylvania on the Children's Partnership, and the Crime Commission in the state of Pennsylvania was one of the first funders for the initial blueprint work, which started off looking at 10 programs, which we thought were good. Excuse me. Were good programs that deserve to be replicated and initiated on a large scale. So let's welcome Clay as Clay comes to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. Clay?
Good morning. Thank you, Del. And I'm going to be brief. It really was a pleasure to, well, first of all, happy tax day to everyone. I hope you got those checks in so that federal agencies can get funded, right, Bob? It's really a personal privilege and honor to introduce this morning's keynote speaker. I've had the privilege of knowing and working with Bob Listenby for, we decided this morning, about 25 or 26 years. And during that time, I've known Bob Listenby to be a man of extraordinary passion and commitment to issues affecting kids, and especially kids at risk and those who come into the juvenile justice system. His biography is in your program, and so I'm not going to be repetitive, but I think some highlights are worth noting. He was appointed by President Obama in the position of Administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention in February of 2013, and sworn in March, a little over a year ago, of last year. Prior to that, and those of us from Pennsylvania who knew Bob and worked with Bob knew him as the head of the Juvenile Defenders Unit in Philadelphia, where he represented thousands of young people who went before the juvenile court system in the city of Philadelphia. But beyond his day-to-day professional activities, he was also a statewide leader in Pennsylvania by leading the first development, if you will, of a statewide Juvenile Defenders Association representing public defenders, representing children and juveniles in the juvenile justice system. He was also an active participant and a leader in Pennsylvania's Models for Change initiative, supported by the MacArthur Foundation. And in 2011, he was honored as the Champion for Change by the MacArthur Foundation for his work around juvenile justice reform. Bob's accomplishments go on and on and on, and so I encourage you to read more about him in your program. You might note that he attended undergraduate school and received a degree from Harvard University, one of those schools up in the Northeast, and graduated from law school at the Bolt Hall School of Law at the University of California at Berkeley. Beyond that, it's important to know Bob Listenby as the person, beyond his professional accomplishments. He's an extraordinarily passionate man about this work. He lives it day and night, and he has done so for the last 30 years. I learned this morning and last night that after college, Bob taught school in Africa, after which he brought several of the young people with whom he worked in Africa to this country and oversaw their education after coming to the United States. He also served as a house parent to 10 young people, while he also was a full-time public defender in Philadelphia. So spending 85 or 90 hours a week is not uncommon for Bob Listenby. And finally, it's important to know that Bob listens very closely. I've always knew Bob as someone who never proclaimed to know everything about everything, and he was always interested in getting different points of view and sometimes competing and divergent interests. Bob Listenby, in my opinion, is a remarkable man who brings to the office of Administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice a unique and unprecedented background. And so please join me in welcoming this morning's kickoff opening keynote speaker, Mr. Bob Listenby. Bob.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Denver, Colorado. It is such an honor to be here this morning to address the Blueprints Conference. As many of you may know, and as Clay indicated, I worked in Philadelphia as a public defender for many years, and Pennsylvania was one of the leading states in the nation in the development of Blueprints programs. As a lawyer, I recommended literally hundreds of children to Blueprints programs, functional family therapy in particular, but also multi-systemic therapy and many others. So I've had a lot of familiarity with the programs, and so when Clay asked if I would like to come and address the audience this morning, I jumped at the opportunity. But what I want you to know from the very beginning is that as the administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the office being within the Office of Justice Programs at the Department of Justice, there is tremendous interest in your work here. There's tremendous interest. So much interest that when I announced that I was going to be speaking here, many people invited themselves to a prep session to explain to me the things I needed to say to you today. So while my remarks are specific, they're a little longer than I normally would like, and we're giving opportunities for people to address some of the remarks by way of question and answer afterward. So for many years, along with many others, have led comprehensive research in juvenile justice, youth development, and program evaluation at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. That work has informed us about what works and what doesn't work. Our nation has made enormous strides in identifying what works and what doesn't work as we've gone through the developmental phases, and the Blueprints program has certainly been a leader in this respect. We know that we want kids to live productive, healthy, crime-free lives, and that a lot of the programs that you all work with, both through Blueprints and through your other programming efforts across the nation, are helping a lot of young people develop. I want to, first of all, thank Dr. Delbert Elliott, the founding director of the Center for the Study and Prevention of Violence, for his work that he has done in the development of the Blueprints program. I'd like you to recognize him, if you will. I would also like to acknowledge Clay Yeager, who has been working with the Blueprints Policy Group that invited me here today. And as Clay indicated, we've known each other for many, many years, and he's been working with the Blueprints program for 35 years. And for me, he was the embodiment of juvenile justice in the state of Pennsylvania for so many of those years that I was sitting back in the audience at the back, sort of sitting at Clay's feet, learning what I could about juvenile justice. I'm talking about back in 1990, 91, 92, when I went to the statewide conferences that were led by the judges in our state and tried my best to learn everything I could about juvenile justice. Clay understood very early on, better than most other people, that dollars spent every day in Pennsylvania, if they were spent and spent well on evidence-based programs, were more likely to produce savings, to reduce the number of kids going into incarceration, and with better outcomes for kids. So it's been his leadership for so many of the years that I've been involved in juvenile justice that I followed. I think Clay would indicate that during a 10-year period, the Pennsylvania Coalition's implementation of the Communities That Care model saw a 10% drop in juvenile crime rates and a 33% improvement in educational performance. So he has a lot of experience at this, and I'm so honored to say that I know him, that I respect him, that I've worked under his direction for so many years. So please acknowledge my good friend and my colleague, Clay Yeager. Finally, in Pennsylvania, we have leadership, and I'm so honored that a person who has been like a dean of juvenile justice for me, Judge Arthur Grimm, is also present here in the audience. Judge Grimm is so reluctant to whenever I make comments about his presence, but he has been a leader and an inspiration for me. Those of you who've had a chance to see the Kids for Cash movie should know that he was, the guiding principle, the guiding light behind the changes and innovations that were made as a result of the scandal that we had in Luzerne County. And so often I would go to meetings and listen to him give direction to how we should address those issues and go forward. So I'm so honored to see you here again, Judge Grimm. Your leadership has meant so much to me as a person developing a practice in public defender work across the state of Pennsylvania. So thank you so much, sir. Finally, I was asked to speak today in detail, which I rarely do, about a lot of things related to evaluations and the blueprints. And I accepted the challenge, and with the assistance of many people on my staff, I have work here that I would like to show you as we go forward. But before we get into the sort of nuts and bolts of what we do in the evaluation implementation area, I'd just like to share with you a few basic principles that guide my work with kids. And I thought that I would share these with you so you would understand that I'm really connected with kids first and foremost, and that as we get into these other issues involving how to address their issues in the juvenile justice system, that I bring these ideas along with me. I attended a conference in Pennsylvania. The room was filled with about 1,200 people, and on the stage were 12 children who had been successful in their juvenile justice encounters. And the question was asked of them, who made the most difference in your life while you were in the juvenile justice system? And as they were answering, their first answer, of course, was their probation officer. Their probation officer. And boy, did I learn something that day. The second answer was their judge. And so after listening to this session with 1,200 people in the room, I stood up as a lonely soul in front of the audience and said, well, what about your public defender? What about your public defender? What about that lawyer who worked so hard to represent you in court? And not one of the 12 actually mentioned that their lawyer was the most significant person in their lives. So I'd ask you to take what I learned from that lesson, which is, one, that reading is really important, and two, that probation officers and judges are critical to what we do in going forward. At another conference, and as I go to conferences, I try and take one thing away. So I was asking myself, what would it be that you would take away from my presentation today? And I really wasn't sure what that would be, but I wanted to just give you a few of the things that I've learned at 4 or 5 conferences. The second thing that kids taught me was they wanted somebody to believe in them. Just believe in them. The third thing I learned at another conference from another kid was, never give up on me. Never give up on me. And I translated that into a speech that Winston Churchill once gave, which was, never give up, never give up, never give up. We were watching Kids for Cash last week at the Justice Department, where we had a screening. And Hillary, one of the young ladies in the movie, stood up and said, I want you, Bob Listenby, to tell the world that whenever they have kids in placement, that the people who are hired to supervise them should simply like kids. That's a profound statement. And as you watch the movie Kids for Cash, you will think about it in terms of what Hillary said. She said she just simply wanted to be with people who liked kids, and that an awful lot of people didn't. So those are the basic things that I love. The final thing I learned was about love. And I learned this from watching two people, Christina Bradley and Anne Marie Ambrose, because with them, it was never about concepts and developmental ideas. It was about the kid that was standing in front of them. Both Christine Bradley and Anne Marie Ambrose could tell you the names of kids that they met and worked with 20 years ago. Those same kids came to see them and talk to them 20 years later. Why? Because they connected with them at a level that was profound. And so what I learned out of all of that was the same thing my mother taught me, which is that love is profound. If you share it with a child, it will last forever. As I hitchhiked around the world, I was literally on the opposite side of the world, and I could feel my mother's love and presence with me no matter where I went. And it bolstered me and gave me confidence to deal with the things in the world. So as you're thinking about working with kids, I would encourage you to think about making sure that the kids that you are working with are connected with somebody who simply loves them and feels closely connected with them. It may be a parent, it may be a guardian, it may be a mentor, it may be you. But if we can have that done, then we will move forward and we'll be able to do a better job of transforming our systems and improving the lives of kids in our juvenile justice system in America. So that said, what I want to talk to you a little bit about today is about what we're doing at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention with our Model Programs Guide, crimesolutions.gov, some of our programs that focus on trauma, and some of our programs that focus on reform. When I finish, I would like to open up for questions about where we're going. I think I'll tell you and give you a pretty clear idea about the things that we think are important and the ideas that we believe that are critical to our reforming the system as we go forward. One of the things that is most shocking, and it's hard to believe, is that we in the United States incarcerate children at a much higher rate than any place else in the world. This is a statistic that comes from 2002. I have one on the next slide from 2011. This is an Annie E. Casey Foundation report that showed that our nation incarcerates kids at a much higher rate than anybody else. And if you look, you'll see that South Africa is the second largest state for incarceration of kids, or second largest nation. As you'll see also, we place children in confinement as of 2011 at a rate of 196. So we've made some progress since 2002. But if you take a second look, you'll see that there are enormous disparities in the rates at which we incarcerate kids. For white kids, we incarcerate them at a rate of 112. For black kids, at a rate of 521. American Indian kids at a rate of 361. And for Hispanic kids at a rate of 202. In a country that prides itself on equal protection under the law, regardless of background or socioeconomic status, this is a disturbing set of statistics, and in fact, it's an embarrassing set of statistics. What I know is that we in this country can do better. And I want you to know that we at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention are committed to doing just that. What I want you to know also is the statistics that we've looked at show us something that's very, very basic. The majority of kids of any race or ethnicity who are in secure confinement do not pose a threat to public safety. About 2 of 3 in the kids who are locked up in the United States are locked up for non-violent offenses, like drug offenses, property offenses, or even status offenses. We still have a problem with our status offenders not only being confined at detention facilities, but actually being adjudicated delinquent and going deeper into our juvenile justice systems. It's obvious and important that we protect our communities. We need to have a conversation across the nation about whether we're doing that by locking up so many kids for nonviolent offenses. That's why I felt it was so important to come out and talk to you all who are on the front lines here working with Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development, and you all who are on the front lines who recognize that this is a public health issue. These kids are often sent to facilities hundreds of miles away from home, away from their families and friends, and this is a particularly serious problem with children who are American Indian and Alaska Native, and children who are in rural areas in our country. We have a predominantly rural country, and after you get outside the big cities, a lot of our kids are being hauled away from those rural communities and placed in facilities hundreds of miles away from homes, particularly our bigger states. A lot of our kids are going into adult facilities. There they run a higher risk of suicide, physical assault, and rape. Kids in adult facilities are often put in solitary confinement where they languish for months. The fact that we are still putting kids in solitary confinement where they receive their food through little slots in the door is something of grave concern to us and something that we really want to address from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. I also want you to know that things don't get much better when our kids reenter their communities. There's an appalling lack of reentry services across the nation. And one of the things we are planning to do at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention is to develop reentry programs and models to share with you. And we're also planning to do something that's really obvious, which is to learn from so many of you in states that have made a lot of progress on these issues, what's really working and what's working well. One of the most basic tenets of all public health and medical intervention policies and practices is the Hippocratic Oath, which is to do no harm. Yet we as adults in our juvenile justice system are putting kids in situations where they are coming out more harmed than they were when we put them in. I want to communicate with you also about trauma. And again, we had some general ideas about trauma when I first arrived at the office, but we've received studies that have helped us understand better the extreme high rates of trauma that children are exposed to who are in the juvenile justice system. A study supported by our office called the Northwestern Juvenile Project is the first ever large-scale longitudinal study of drug, alcohol, and psychiatric disorders in a diverse sample of juvenile detainees. Among the many findings, the research revealed that 84% of the youth in the Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center had experienced more than one trauma. And more than 56% had been exposed to 6 or more traumatic experiences. 56%. Now, we know that children who are involved in trauma, be that physical or sexual abuse, be that witnessing domestic violence, be that addiction in the home or the incarceration of a parent, or seeing a friend killed on the street, we know that children who are exposed to trauma are derailed from the normal developmental paths that they experience in childhood. We know that in order to get them back on the right path, we have to have them treated with trauma-informed care. And trauma-informed care is not widespread in our nation at the present time. And in fact, the knowledge about trauma and its impact upon children is not widespread. But what I would also ask you to recognize is that our study shows us that children with major psychiatric disorders and functional impairment, of those kids, only 15% in this study were treated while they were in the detention center. So 15%. And only 8% were treated when they returned to their communities. So does this mean basically that we have a situation where 75% of our kids that we come in contact with who've experienced trauma are not actually being exposed to the kind of trauma-informed care that they need while they're in treatment? Now, the National Academy of Sciences report, Reforming Juvenile Justice, a Developmental Approach, which our office commissioned, emphasizes that whether a child is in court or in a facility where they are confined, we must remember that kids are not adults. They're not just small adults. The National Academy report emphasizes that harsh, punitive practices that characterize most juvenile facilities do not meet the developmental needs of children in their care. According to this report, and this report is the guideline for where we're going in juvenile justice at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, this report emphasized that the 3 most important components of healthy psychological development for adolescents are the involvement of a supportive adult authority figure, which is why we emphasize mentoring in the work that we do, association with pro-social peers, which is why we emphasize that low-level offenders, children who are at low risk of reoffending, who have minor offenses, should not be placed in with children who are at high risk of reoffending, who are involved with violent offending, because what happens is they simply use it as a reform school education university for learning how to be better juvenile delinquents. Not that I know this, but we have research that shows this, and I'll touch on that momentarily. We also recognize that kids need activities that encourage autonomous decision-making. And what we do with kids when we put them in confinement is that we tell them what to do from the time we wake them up to the time we put them to bed. There's no room for decision-making there. So we want to encourage you to think about these three elements in facilities, deep end facilities, or wherever you're keeping kids in detention centers and so forth, because they have, research is telling us that this is the direction we need to go. Now let me be clear about one thing, because I'm often misinterpreted on this issue. There are large numbers of children that we come in contact with in our states who need the benefit of being placed in a juvenile justice delinquency facility. There are large numbers of kids who need those facilities. However, we need these facilities to have these three elements in them if we are really to rehabilitate the children. So I don't want to be misunderstood on this issue. In order to be effective in meeting the challenge of reducing juvenile offending, reducing recidivism in the state and local level, we must refocus our juvenile justice model so they're not focused on punishment, and instead adopt a model that acknowledges the changes that children go through, and also that foster positive development and still hold kids accountable. In September of this year, the National Academy will provide a second report to us. We thought it was very important to get the first report, but when you look at the report, all 443 pages of it, one thing you realize is that this is not an implementation study. I would like to give a copy to every SAG member or state advisory group member in the nation. In doing that, though, it doesn't give guidance to people who are on the ground, on the front lines, dealing with change. So we went back to the Academy and we asked them if they could give us an implementation study. And so we're going to receive that study in September, and we look forward to sharing it with the nation. How do you actually take all these grand ideas, all this knowledge about adolescent development, all this knowledge about neuroscience, and translate it into something that will work on the ground? I want to point out also that much of what's happening, much of what we've learned, you all have taught us. You all who are on the front lines, you all in states that I'll mention momentarily. Another study that was undertaken was Pathways to Desistance. Pathways teaches us that incarceration does not reduce recidivism. Now, we've had a lot of conversations with one of the principal investigators, Ed Mulvey, and we've actually asked Ed to speak with judges in different places. One of the most striking things about conversations Ed has had with judges is that the judges will look at Ed and say, "We recognize that your study is sound. We recognize it's based upon children in Philadelphia and Phoenix, but it just doesn't apply to us. It just doesn't apply to us." This study that Ed undertook finds that in contrast to youth formerly processed in institutional care, youth who received community-based supervision, aftercare services, were more likely to attend school, to go to work, and avoid future offending during the 6 months after release, and longer supervision periods that would increase the benefits. Many of you know that we at the Office of Justice Programs have developed crimesolutions.gov, which provides a database of evidence-based programs and practices. It also highlights the formal juvenile justice system processing as a practice, and it highlights that we can increase, that these practices increase recidivism. Given the fact that incarceration alone is not good for kids, and it's not effective at protecting public safety, it boggles the mind that we continue to waste taxpayers' dollars simply putting so many kids in placement. And again, the statistics that I showed you earlier on should be a guidepost for that. The American Correctional Association states that we spend on average $240 a day, or $88,000 a year, to keep kids in juvenile facilities on the deep end. Now, we had a report from Commissioner Gladys Carrion, who reported to the Attorney General at a coordinating council meeting, that when she began her role as head of the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, it cost the state of New York $262,000 a year per child, and they had 36 facilities where they had children. Let me repeat that because that's astounding. $262,000 per year per child for secure confinement for kids in New York State. Their recidivism rate, 80%. Recidivism rate, 80%. Those are her reports to the Attorney General at a coordinating council that we held in Washington, D.C. Now, the good news is that, working with her staff, They've closed down 24 of those 36 facilities. But they had the challenge of closing down facilities, recognizing that some of the facilities that had no kids were still fully staffed. I also understand from my colleagues in California that they had facilities that were also fully staffed and no kids. I don't want to decry the situation because placement programs do provide jobs, and we need to recognize that as we reform these systems, we need to find effective ways for addressing the issue of jobs in communities where you have large unemployment. And if we're going to be able to successfully reform these systems, we have to find ways to find alternative employment for the people who are in these systems. While there is no perfect formula that will guarantee reductions in all crime, we know that policies that include prevention and intervention in the community for nonviolent offenders bring better outcomes for youth and for public safety than placing these young people in locked facilities. Services and treatment in community are a fraction of the cost, and these services have been shown to be more effective at preventing recidivism than incarceration. I feel extremely fortunate to have the pleasure and opportunity to work for Attorney General Eric Holder. One of the things that he recognized when he was in a position as Deputy Attorney General of the United States back in 1999 was that so many of the children who appeared in our system have been exposed to violence. He started the Safe Start program, and this initiative has brought awareness and knowledge about how to address the issues of children exposed to violence. In 2009, in his new capacity as Attorney General, the first wave of findings from the National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence was released. And there's some startling figures which I think are important for us to recognize. That survey showed that 60% of the children in our nation are exposed to violence. This is violence as witnesses, violence in their homes and communities and schools, and this was in the one-year period prior to the survey. Attorney General Holder started the Defending Childhood Initiative, and then in 2010, he asked that we establish a national task force on children's exposure to violence, and he selected me as co-chair of his task force. We released a lot of recommendations, among them that we have a public awareness campaign so that people can better understand what it means for kids to be exposed to violence. The one other thing that we stress, and I'd like to leave with you as one of the central ideas around the issue of children's exposure to violence, is this: that every child who comes in contact with our systems should be screened, assessed, and treated for exposure to violence. We believe fundamentally that if we can do that, that we will lower the number of kids who come into our juvenile justice system. And when we're talking about screening, we're talking about when they walk in the school door, we're talking about when they go to their pediatricians, when they go to other activities which allow for proper screening. And we're talking about developing across the nation in universities and colleges, and developing across the nation resources that allow our children to receive trauma-informed care. Why? Because we know that children who do not have their trauma addressed have their normal path for development derailed, and they find it more difficult to get back on path. Now, I worked with kids for years as a public defender. I did not understand this. It took me a one-year tutorial with some of the best clinicians in the nation, some of the best psychiatrists in the nation, to fully understand the meaning of trauma and trauma-informed care. Once I understood, I went back to court as a lawyer, and there was a young lady about to be sentenced for violation of a drug court protocol. She had been away from home and had taken drugs. And I asked the judge, I said, "Your Honor, I really need you to stop for a moment. Let's have another evaluation of this young lady, because I believe that she has significant trauma in her background." We examined the young lady. We did a full psychiatric workup. And we found that she had been an eyewitness to a friend having his brains shot out. She had been around the corner when another friend had been shot and killed. Her father had been placed in jail for life for murder that he said he didn't commit. She had been separated from her family and had been raped, and that none of these traumatic experiences had been addressed. I explained to the judge the meaning of trauma and trauma-informed care and the importance of it. Of course, the judge insisted that he was fully aware of trauma and trauma-informed care. He'd been on the bench for many years. But I managed to convince him that this particular child should not be locked up. That wasn't the answer to the problem, and he went along with my recommendation. So I want you to be aware that even I, a public defender who worked on these issues for 26 years, was not aware until basically the last 2 years that I was there about the importance of trauma. We have a lot of work to do with this issue in our nation. As many of you know, the Attorney General and the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, began work on addressing the issue of the school-to-prison pipeline through our Support School Discipline Initiative. That work is designed to reduce harsh exclusionary discipline practices in schools. And the reason we want to do this is because there was a Texas study, Breaking School Rules, and any of you who have not had the opportunity to read the Texas study should really check it out. That Texas study examined 1 million children, grades 7 through 12. 1 million children. And that study found that there were large numbers of children who were excluded from schools, and that the number was so high that it was shocking, and that about 95 to 96% of the kids had been excluded for nonviolent offenses, and that there were a disproportionate number of African American, Hispanic children who were excluded, and also children with disabilities. So that study led the Attorney General and the Secretary to establish the Supportive School Discipline Initiative, and throughout this year we will be having activities including new rules and guidelines on civil rights released, new data collection tools released, and a lot of emphasis on what we can do to end the school-to-prison pipeline. Now, my colleagues wanted me to be sure to tell you about work that we're doing to advance evidence-based practices. Under the Attorney General's leadership, the Department several years ago launched the Evidence Integration Initiative to support justice practitioners and policymakers by providing better tools and information to help them understand, access, and integrate evidence into the decision-making decisions that they make. When I go over to Congress to talk about our budget, the first question that I get asked is whether we have research to support the programs that we're talking about asking Congress to fund. If we don't have any research, Congress asks us whether we plan to do any research. If we are not planning to do any research, we're not likely to get funding for those kinds of initiatives. And so we are reordering our priorities along with the request of Congress to make sure that we produce evidence-based practices that Congress will support. The initiative has created crimesolutions.gov, an online resource that offers practitioners and policymakers a single, credible source for evidence-based information on policies, programs, and practices across the fields of criminal justice, juvenile justice, and victim services. Crimesolutions.gov includes not only evidence-based programs, but also practices that have been proven effective across multiple programs based on an extensive meta-analysis. Some of you may be aware that the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Model Programs Guide, which dates back almost 15 years, was the precursor to crimesolutions.gov. In fact, many of the juvenile programs housed within Model Programs Guide were reviewed and scored using crimesolutions.gov's more rigorous standards in order to be included when Crime Solutions was launched in 2011. And I'm so happy to say that on my staff, head of our research department, is a person who received an award for the work on crimesolutions.gov. In addition to providing program profiles, the guides offers literature reviews, links to relevant publications, and other resources, and frequently asked questions section. One of our current projects is to develop guides in the area of program implementation. We also have, and many of you are aware, the Office of Justice Programs Diagnostic Center, which provides technical assistance to state, local, and tribal governments to diagnose their unique criminal justice, juvenile justice, and victim services issues, and to use data-driven programs tailored to a particular community's risks and strengths. We see evidence-based programs and practices not as a static body, but rather as a platform to move the field forward. It's a formative and ever-growing process. We understand that we don't live in a perfect world, and improving our practice is necessary both for funding purposes and also for better outcomes for kids. One of the really cross-cutting initiatives that we have at the present time is the Juvenile Justice Reform and Reinvestment Initiative. This began in 2011. It was actually an initiative where we were approached by other departments within the federal government and asked to experiment with new ways of improving our practices. This is the Office of Management and Budget's Partnership Fund, which actually funded this initiative. They would like to move forward on this effort, and they've asked us to pilot sites in Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Delaware. One key component of JJRRI is the Standardized Program Evaluation Protocol, also known as SPEP. This Standardized Program Evaluation Protocol provides a standard rating scheme by which a program can be compared to the evidence base established by proven programs, and then serve as a roadmap for program improvement to elevate the quality and rigor of the program. Now, what does this mean in practical terms? Many people have approached the Justice Department and said this: there are programs that we have that aren't funded because they're not model programs, they're not evidence-based programs. We want to improve our programs, but you don't provide us any tools. What shall we do to improve those programs? And the Office of Management and Budget said, okay, OJJDP, you've got to do something in this area because we're getting complaints from Congress, where Congress is saying to us that they don't want to just fund the programs that you've already developed or that your colleagues have developed. They want to remain open to people all across the nation improving their programs so we can move them up the ladder so that they can become evidence-based programs. And so that's how this Standardized Program Evaluation Protocol began. Many of you know Dr. Mark Lipsky, who is working with us on this initiative, and that's how it continues to expand. Another advantage of this protocol is that it is not a top-down imposition of a set of programs or program guides. It's based upon effective practices that are gleaned from an extensive meta-analysis. Communities can work with programs they already have and develop on those programs or improve those programs. Through this combined approach, we've continued to develop model programs. Resource sharing through our Crime Solutions and Model Programs Guide has helped us improve our efforts. And now this work with this SPEP protocol in our juvenile justice reform efforts is helping us with reinvestment and initiatives such as that. Now, one of the things that people have emphasized to us is simply that we can no longer just focus on improving programs. We must focus on the process of enhancing entire systems. If we fail to do this, we're simply going to be investing in what's called justice by geography. Justice by geography says basically you take a series of programs, you invest in them heavily, particularly in places that are well-resourced, which are a lot of our big cities are. But rural areas don't improve. Small counties don't improve. So you have to develop an approach that works across an entire state. And that's what we're doing now. Our entire effort at the present time is to find, first of all, from states that have done systems enhancement across their states, what's working and how they've gone about doing this, and to take those kernels of knowledge and wisdom and use them for developing programs in a nation. We've asked for significant funding so that we can do systems enhancement at the state level and make sure that our systems enhancement is designed to improve every single county in that state. When I say systems enhancement, this is what I mean. We talk a lot about, when we talk about racial and ethnic disparities, a lot of it happens at the arrest stage. There are very few programs that address this issue with law enforcement. But we're looking to work with law enforcement so that we can find out ways to both improve officer safety and reduce the number of children who are arrested. States like Connecticut have already achieved this goal. They've been working in this area for more than a decade. When I worked in Pennsylvania, we also were working on this area. But as a national effort, we have not done a lot at the arrest stage, and we recognize that this is where many of our disparities occurred. So we're working there. We also want to work on diversion programs and developing community-based options. We also want to work on improving the adjudicatory hearing process. What young people tell us, without a doubt, is that if they perceive that the juvenile justice system is fair, if their voices are heard, they're more likely to comply with the requests of probation officers and judges than if they're treated like they don't really count. When we looked at reforming juvenile justice, a developmental approach, it stressed this same fact. So we plan to work to improve indigent defense across the nation. We also plan to work with prosecutors, because what we've learned is that for years, our office did not fund anything, not one dime, towards juvenile prosecutors. Prosecutors need training. They need to develop standards. They need to understand more about adolescent development. They need to understand trauma. So we plan to work closely with them also. We also need to work on systems enhancement for reentry, job training for reentry. So when we talk about overall systems, we're looking at both what happens in the court and a wide array of activities involved with prevention. So this is what we're looking to do as we go forward with entire juvenile justice systems improvement projects across the nation. I want to just point out to you a few jurisdictions before I close that are doing a lot of work towards using evidence-based programs to reduce the number of kids who are in placement and reducing overall impact regarding their system and regarding kids. Let's talk briefly about several states. We have, as examples, California, Connecticut, Georgia, Illinois, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, New York, Ohio, Texas, Washington, and Wisconsin. They're using evidence-based alternatives to incarceration. They're establishing policies and practices and programs that divert youth out of the system, particularly using kids who are in dual youth programs, delinquency and dependency crossover programs. They're closing state-run facilities and engaging in statewide realignment and reinvestment. If we look for a moment at Connecticut, we'll see that the state of Connecticut reduced residential commitments from 680 in 2000 to 216 in 2011, a nearly 70% reduction. Connecticut has expanded its investments in evidence-based programs, family-focused adolescent treatment programs, with proven success in reducing problem behaviors from $300,000 to $39 million in terms of improvements and increasing its investment in community-based programs. Connecticut reduced judicial processing or formal petitions of status offenders, referrals from 50% of those filed in 2006-2007 to 4.5% of them in 2010-2011. So they made significant strides. They've also made significant strides in the area of addressing issues of racial and ethnic disparity. As I mentioned earlier, they've done a lot of work with law enforcement, and I believe they serve as a model for what can happen when law enforcement gets engaged, gets trained, and then goes out to reduce their involvement both in schools and also across their entire state. Ohio, through Reclaim Ohio, is funding initiatives that encourage juvenile courts to use community-based options by diverting youth from Ohio's Department of Youth Services institutions. Courts can increase the level of funds available for those community-based options. Between 1992 and 2012, Ohio's Department of Youth Services population dropped from 2,600 to less than 550. What I would point out about Ohio, as I'm learning a lot more about the state, is they still have many counties that are not involved with Reclaim Ohio. But what they have done is they served as a model for the state of Illinois, which I'm going to address in just a moment. But in Ohio, every dollar spent on Reclaim Ohio programs, the state saves from $11 to $45 in commitment and processing costs, depending upon the risk level of the child. Redeploy Illinois modeled its fiscal incentives for juvenile justice reform after Reclaim Ohio. Since 2005, counties participating in Redeploy Illinois achieved a 56% average reduction in commitments. Preliminary results of cost-effectiveness studies among 4 redeploy sites point to a 14.2% reincarceration rate for Redeploy Illinois participants compared to 57.4% among non-participants. I think I would simply say that they made a lot of progress in the counties that are involved in Redeploy Illinois. But again, we're looking for statewide comprehensive reform as we go forward. There's good news coming out of the South. I understand that Clay and others were involved in Georgia, where the state is focusing on several major aspects to its initiative. One of those aspects is simply they say you cannot take a child who is charged with a misdemeanor and put them in placement, that is in detention or in deep end placement, unless that child has committed a felony. Now, that's a radical idea in the state that I come from. The idea that children who committed misdemeanors can't be placed at all, that you have to use community options. So a lot of us will be looking very closely at how things work in Georgia, and we at the federal government are interested in figuring out how, if at all, we can help the initiatives that are going on in Georgia and other states like Georgia. I understand that Texas has a similar provision in its statutes as well. As we look at overall this process of reform, we recognize that reducing costs is significant, since you can get a college education for $88,000 a year. We recognize that improving practices through evidence-based practices is critical, and we recognize that using a developmental approach is key to go forward. It seems to me that as we go forward, I would like you to simply think about the kinds of things that really matter to kids. I would like you to remember that simply learning how to read and getting a good education is important to kids who are coming to our system. I'd like you to remember that kids really believe, they want you to believe in them, that kids really need someone to love them and care about them, that kids just really need to know that you like them as people. And as you go forward and look at all the things that we're doing at the national level, I would like you to remember that we believe fundamentally that knowledge, most of the knowledge that I've seen since I've arrived in Washington, has flowed from the states to Washington. We have research and evidence-based practices that we can develop in Washington, and then we want to use to showcase in your states across the nation. So I see what we're doing as developing partnerships with those of you who are here in the audience. And I would encourage you to seek us out, ask us how we can work with you, help us figure out how we can partner with you for demonstration projects. And if we come to your state to develop a comprehensive reform initiative, I would ask you to join with us and to help us. My final request, though, is really for something more on a personal level, and that is this. As Tina Bradley and Anne Marie Ambrose have taught me, and as other colleagues have taught me, I would ask each of you, there are enough of you here in this room to really change the direction of our country. If each of you can just find one kid and connect that one kid with one person who's going to love that kid and work with that kid, not over a week or month or a year, but work with that kid over a period of years to make sure that that kid gets reintegrated into his community and family. That would really start the process of changing what's happening here in this country. I know we have programs. I know we're all focused on using the knowledge that we've learned and that we continue to develop, certainly in our research efforts in Washington. But for me, at the personal level, working with kids as I have, one kid I've worked with for over 15 years now, if we can do that, then we're going to change the dial. We're going to move the dial on all these major issues across the nation, and we're going to be a much better nation forward. I'd like to thank you for taking time to allow me to speak to you this morning, and I look forward to talking to you in the future. Thank you. I would just caution you that with the bright lights on, it's very difficult to see. So if you have a question, you get to a microphone, I'll be listening. Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your remarks. They were both very passionate, and I could see how you were really connecting on a personal level, but then also bringing in the research that is also so important. What I wanted to ask was, you mentioned the Supportive School Discipline Project,
Yes.
which I understand is also being coordinated with the Department of Education.
Yes.
You mentioned Arne Duncan was
With the
working
Department
on
of
that.
Education, with Health and Human Services, and with other federal agencies that are actively involved. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Sure. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit on that project, particularly because it's, my understanding is that it's really trying to catch kids downstream before they're even touching upon these systems, and what that might look like for some kids who are entering school, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and sometimes they're sort of peeled off. And I'm just curious, if you can just give us a little bit more context about what that initiative looks like. Thank you.
Thank you. The Attorney General and the Secretary were appalled by the results of breaking school rules coming out of Texas. And what they sought to do initially was to raise awareness. Once they got into it, they realized that schools need guidance from the civil rights divisions of the Justice Department and the Department of Education. So this past, about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, the Secretary and the Attorney General released guidance on the issue of civil rights from both the Department of Education and also the Department of Justice. So that guidance is out there. The second thing they wanted to do was to improve the data collection systems so that every one of you can go to their data collection website and find out how your school in your local community is doing regarding suspensions and expulsions. And so you can now do that. I don't have the website with me, and I apologize for that, but I can provide it to the conference organizers and send that to you. But you can now go to a website and find out how your school is doing, because the Secretary and the Attorney General recognize that it's people like yourselves who are involved in systems change, in your community that want to know how your school is doing. So they worked on that, and that's available. A recent study that came out and was reported to us last week at our coordinating council indicated that children in elementary school and preschool are being suspended and expelled. It was startling to learn about the rates of suspensions and expulsions, and particularly the disparities issue is present there for minority youth as well. So we haven't actually developed a response to that since this was just reported to us last week. But I will tell you that that data is now available to you as well. The Secretary and the Attorney General are working with COPS Office. The COPS Office is developing training protocol for school resource officers so they have a better idea of what they should do when they address issues within schools. And I'm sure that the Secretary of Education is working with teachers, principals, and superintendents to develop training protocols to improve classroom management so that people who are in school can address issues of disruption more effectively. I know they're doing that as well. We will soon have a conference this summer, and once that conference happens, we will be sharing with the nation, in general, the ideas that are behind the Support School Discipline Initiative and the things that we plan to do to improve things. I will point out one other thing that the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges is doing. As many of you know, Judge Teske has traveled across the country looking to develop a set of memoranda of understanding between schools and juvenile justice systems. That whole process has been codified into a toolkit, and it's now being piloted in 16 different locations across the nation. And that piloting initiative, that Pathways initiative that's called, is being used by judges to try and figure out how they can sort of close the front door to the juvenile justice system, open up opportunities to provide prevention programs access, mental health access, access to mental health programs, and access to substance abuse programs for children who leave schools and come in contact with our juvenile justice system. So those are some of the functions that are going on. We haven't actually rolled it out in a comprehensive fashion, but that's coming soon, and I hope that that helps to answer the question that you asked. Thank you.
I'd also like to thank you for your comprehensive and personal remarks. I want to go back to one thing you said about your experiences with Congress and asking for money, which I suspect is one of the hardest parts of your job, and that Congress wants to know about the research that backs the programs or anticipated research that would support it. With regard to how close are we to using the SPEP scores as a way to, as a proxy for evidence-based programs? That is, I know SPEP scores go up to 100, and LIPSI did find that some so-called non-formally designated evidence-based programs did as well, if not better, than some of the evidence-based programs. So again, how close are we able to use those SPEP scores as a proxy for evidence-based programs?
That's an excellent question. I don't know the answer definitively at this point. I will tell you this. Everything in Washington has been speeding up as we get closer to the end of this administration. And the Office of Management Budget is very eager to get the results in from the work that Dr. Lipsky and others have been doing in this area. So I anticipate probably a year, but I can't say definitively how long it's going to be before we're going to be able to use it. But we want to make sure that it actually works. When I say I go to Congress, I mean literally Congress will say to me, look, what's the latest research on this issue? And it's not that they tell me they won't fund things that don't have research. They just don't fund them. That's all. It's an interesting process.
I want to thank you so much for your very inspiring and informing presentation today. And I also appreciated that you tied it in with the concerns in the public health community, what we know from the ACE study, for example, from Kaiser Permanente, the long-term healthcare costs that are associated from childhood trauma. So this is a lifelong issue. We tend to be focusing mostly on while the children are adolescents, but this will affect them their entire lives. My question to you, however, is what I did not hear a lot of, and I'm wondering if you could expand on the role that OJJDP feels they can play in strengthening families' roles and healing the family so that we can reduce the recidivism. I know Cory Booker in Newark used parenting education to reduce recidivism in his Newark jails from 65% down to 7% by implementing parenting education. So I'm wondering if you could address that for us.
Well, that's good news to know because actually I have a meeting with the senator very soon. When I arrived in Washington, what I found was that the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention had been conducting listening sessions across the nation on family engagement. And we were working closely with many of the leaders in the area of family engagement. We put out our sort of reports on the extent of our engagement with families. What we have not done thus far and what we are going to do before the end of this calendar year is to actually set forth our policies on family engagement. So we're planning to do that. We're working closely with the advocates. We are behind time on that. It should have been done before I got to Washington, but it hasn't. So I'm going to make sure that that does come out this year. I come from a state where family engagement was a central part of what we believed in, what we did. We had a family engagement guide, which we shared with all of us who were advocates in the state. So it's something that was a part of my practice long before I got to Washington, and I'm surely going to do everything I can to make it a part of a national practice. What I would ask you again, though, across the nation is this. We need feedback on these policies. I don't want to make policies in a vacuum. I can put forth anything that makes sense up on a website and call it a policy, but if you don't tell me it has meaning in terms of your daily lives and the things that you're doing in your communities, then it's an idle effort as far as I'm concerned. We're going to put forth a policy on youth engagement also. And when I say youth engagement, I mean young people need to be at the table involved in setting policy for what happens to them in the juvenile justice system. Now, we've all been engaged in youth engagement for a long time also. But with youth engagement, what happens is that we get young people into our organizations. We don't pay them. They stay for a short while. They age out, and then we don't replace them. Or we have somebody who's 35 years old, and they're our youth representative. So we've got to change that. We had our Federal Advisory Committee on Juvenile Justice gave us some very good guidelines for youth engagement. But when I put these out with guidance and with respectful input from all of you, I would like to know whether they are working, whether they are changing the paradigm, whether they are making a difference. What I can tell you is that I learn a lot of things from young people. They tell me things that move me and change what I do. But I would like to know that that's also happening for all of you across the nation, as well as for families. I would point out one thing that I found really startling. In Indiana, they have a detention center. I believe it's a detention center practice across the nation. And they allow families to visit their children 24/7. Anytime the families want to come visit. This is a Mr. Dempsey who's in charge of that. And he told me that 24/7 families can come to their detention center, and it has improved the interaction between kids and the people who are in the detention center, and between families and the juvenile justice center, and it's reduced injuries to staff, and they saved hundreds of thousands of dollars because it's reduced injuries to staff caused by violent interactions between kids. So we have a lot to learn about family engagement in the answer to your question. Thank you. Clay is looking a little anxious. That means I have about 5 minutes or less. No, he's saying a little bit more.
I'd like to thank you also for being here. I'm in the corner to your left.
Okay, all right.
Sorry. Thank you for taking questions today also. My question related to your statistic you gave for Connecticut, where that is 70% drop in residential treatment rates in the last decade. Do you have any statistics that would also connect that to the prison populations and the Department of Corrections for that group of teenagers? Thank you.
We have, we do at the present time a yearly guide on sort of a day in the life of detention facilities in across the nation. So we do that research. We're looking at how we do it and when we do it, because it's usually a year or two old by the time it comes out, and that doesn't really help me very much. I want more current information. But that the residential guide on corrections that we put out through OJJDP is the place where that I would direct you to. If you can speak to me afterward, I'll give you one of my cards, and if you'll just send me an email, I'll make sure you get the information that we have from Brett Donahue, who is our Director of Research. Okay. Or again, if any of you have questions, I certainly, if you can compile them in some way and send them to me, I'll have our staff get back to you, because we want to be responsive to those of you who are leaders in this field and who are making decisions across the country that are improving the lives of our kids. We don't want to be seen as that institution way over there in Washington that sends out all this information on DHS and they kind of think they know it all. We do not know it all in Washington. That which we know, we've learned a lot from you all, and we want to continue to do that as we go forward.
What role do you think?
Where are you located?
I'm right here in the middle.
Okay, I can't see you, but
what role do you think increasing cultural awareness in school curriculums could play in affecting the disparities in the school-to-prison pipeline and the disparities we see in school discipline, specifically for blacks and Hispanics?
Well, I have not actually seen any cultural awareness protocols or programs specifically, nor have I seen any research on them, so I'll have to start there. I am told specifically by our American Indian and Alaska Native children that these, and families and practitioners, that cultural awareness programs make a big difference, particularly in the courtroom setting. And this year we are funding setting forth a program to fund juvenile drug courts in Indian country that are wellness courts that are focused on that cultural issue. As far as working with Hispanic youth and African American youth, I know from my conversations with Hispanic parents and with Hispanic practitioners that they too believe that cultural awareness makes a big difference in the process. And I know that many people believe that it makes a big difference with African Americans. What I don't know is I don't have any research to support that. If any of you do, I would love to see it. If any of you have a research project that you think we should be doing in this area, we have something called field-initiated research. My staff love to say this term, FIRE, field-initiated research. And so if you think there's something we need to do, or if you have some information that will help us share that with the country, then, or you think this is a direction we need to make sure we go in, please bring it to our attention, and it'll be something we take a closer look at. I would love to be able to tell folks that, yes, we have this research, and I'll put it up here and show it to you, and this is what it says, and this is the difference it makes, but I just don't have the knowledge behind me that says that. Yes,
Hi, good morning. Thank you for your comments. My question relates to the savings that result from cutting back on residential placement. Do you know, for the jurisdictions that are actually implementing such programs, the percentage of reinvestment of those funds that are actually reinvested back into community prevention initiatives?
Wow, you hit right on the big problem. The question really is, what percentage of funds that are saved are reinvested? And it is a problem across the nation. We talk a good game, as it said, but when it comes time to reinvest those funds, we don't really reinvest all of them. We reinvest a portion of them, but I have not been able to identify what that portion is. So one of the things that we're planning to do as a part of our initiative as we go forward with Juvenile Justice Reinvestment Initiative is to actually document in advance what the amount of funding that's saved is with states. We want to figure out a way to document that, and we want to be clear that those funds are going to be reinvested in juvenile justice, and we want to be clear to the extent that we can negotiate it with states where those funds are going to be reinvested. Now, you're talking about a lot of moving parts. First, you're talking about saving money, which usually takes a year or two to develop. Then you're talking about taking those savings and reinvesting them based upon with a different Congress or a different House or a different set of political representatives. And then you're talking about investing in certain areas. Now, we know that we need investments in community-based options. We know we need investments in diversion programs. We know we need investments in training programs for kids through reentry and educational programs through reentry. So we think that these are things that ought to be priority, but I think it's going to take really some good negotiating on our part with the states in order to achieve this kind of a change. And I don't know the answer for these states that have worked on these issues. Thank you. See, we're nearing the end of our questions. I don't see any more hands, but the lights are so bright I really can't see otherwise. I have a question up here in front. It's a comment. Okay, thank you. I love to have friends. Remember, I told you guys know more than we do. Civil rights website to find your school, http://ocrdata.ed.gov. That's http://officeofcivilrightsdata.ed.gov or ocrdata.ed.gov. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Administrator Listenby. That's a great start to the conference. I encourage you, to follow up on your questions that you have, and there are those here, I think, who can help answer those questions. We are now adjourned until 10:15, so you have a chance to get out and get some more coffee and do some networking and talking about these issues. And we're starting our breakout sessions at 10:15. Thank you.